The University of Johannesburg, the future reimagined.
Professor Stella Nkomo is a professor in the Department of Human Resources Management at the University of Pretoria and former Deputy Dean for Research and Postgraduate Studies. She holds a PhD in Human Resources Management from the University of Massachusetts in the US. Her current research focuses on diversity and race and gender in organizations. She is the co-author of the critically acclaimed international book, Our Separate Ways, Black and White Women and the Struggle for Professional Identity, published by Harvard Business Review Press. Her research has been published in numerous management journals and edited volumes. She is currently an associate editor for Equity, Diversity and Inclusion, an international journal, and senior editor for diversity entries in the Oxford Research Encyclopedia of Business and Management. She has received numerous awards for her scholarly contributions, including the Sage Scholarly Contributions Award, Academy of Management, for her research on gender and diversity in organizations. Another award was the Distinguished Women Scholar in the Social Sciences Award from the Department of Science and Technology, and the International Leadership Association Lifetime Achievement Award. Professor Nkomo is a rated South African researcher. She's the founding president of the Africa Academy of Management. She's currently a board member of the Academy of Science, South Africa, the Board of Governors of Rhodes University, and the Female Academic Leaders Fellowship. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming Professor Stella Nkomo. And Stella, it's nice to see you again after quite some time. And I hand over to you.
Thank you, Chika, Professor Sihole. Thank you for that very kind introduction. I appreciate that. And hello to everyone at the workshop. I'm sorry I haven't been able to join in more of it. From what I've heard, and now I'm assuming it's making a good contribution to the success of this program. You see on the program, the topic is transformation of South African higher education. And when I thought about what I could say that would be a contribution to our thinking about that, I realized it encompasses many dimensions, from size and structure, funding, access, management systems. And so, of course, I'm going to try to confine my remarks to the academic profile. I'm also mindful that I should do that because my background is human resource management and diversity and inclusion in organizations. So one should always speak about the most about what one might know. So let me share the screen now, if I can. I'll find my presentation and then put it on open. Okay, so what I decided to talk about this morning is what I call the promise and challenges of transforming the professor in South Africa. And I want to start by just talking about this word transformation, the concept of transformation, and the way that we think about it in the management and organization sciences. We think about transformational change as a wicked problem, a wicked problem. And what do I mean by that? I think this diagram will help you to see why it's wicked. You know, with a wicked problem, we're not talking about incremental change, just retooling or revising something. We're thinking about radically changing a system that has a long history from its birth. And if you think about higher education in South Africa, tracing it back to its birth, who were the dominant people who did that, and how that has become entrenched over time to become the status quo way of running and the composition of of universities. But with these systems, no system can last forever, no matter how much the people in it believe that it is the right system, because what happens, transformational change is triggered by disruptive external forces. And that has clearly been the case for South Africa, in terms, of course, beginning with the end of apartheid. But there's continuing forces that are disrupting, which is making this status quo unbearable, untenable. That said, the challenges within trying to achieve transformational change is we're talking about changes in strategy, changes in systems, changes in people, and people who have different perceptions, different attitudes, different vested interest in either change or keeping the status quo. So right now, it feels like we're in chaos. And that's what complexity theory would tell us. We have to have disequilibrium to hopefully come up with something new. The other thing about making this a wicked problem, the time period is not easily controlled. So as much as we would like to think we could decree transformational change or achieve it with a single mandate, it's not going to unfold that way. And the last thing I'll say is that the old system has to die, and that death will be chaotic, but it has to die in order for something new to emerge. And the complicating factor that I will mention later on is that that new state, what we're trying to create, is not always known beforehand. So the unknown of the new state. So just keep that in mind so that my remarks and where I end up with you today, from my point of view and my particular discipline, this idea of what transformational change is as a radical problem, a radical and wicked problem. So I want to talk about the promise of transformation. And I use promise as a verb because from the dawn of democracy and the writing of our Constitution, a promise has been made that there will be transformation, or at least we have created an expectation that transformation will happen, that something new will occur, not only for the but also for higher education. So I've underlined those key words at the end. We believe that South Africa belongs to all of us who live in it, united in our diversity. So hoping for a transformed higher education that actualizes this promise. And so what I did in preparation for this talk, I took some time to peruse the history of the efforts to deliver on this promise, focusing primarily on policies and legislation of the last 27 plus years. Now, I'm going to do like a highlighted review of that because there are people with us today like Professor Siholi. I see Professor Weber is around, many other people, Dr. Mignon, many other people who are scholars of higher education. So I apologize if I don't do full service to this history, but I was reading it with an idea to get a sense of the magnitude of the efforts to deliver on the promise. And I also read it to see what was said, particularly about the transformation of the academic profile. So I'm going to skirt through that relatively quickly and just highlight a few. So we see right from the outset in 1996 that efforts began to transform higher education. President Mandela set up this National Commission on Higher Education, and his brief to them was to preserve what is working, basically, I'm summarizing it, and to change to what's defective and to transform, come up with what we need. And from there, we get the green paper on transformation. And in that green paper, specific reference is made to the imbalances in the ratios of Black and female staff and the need to develop capacity building measures. Then also in that same period, the Higher Education Act of 1977, again to try to transform higher education to reflect the desire to be non-racial and non-sexist. And of course, I think the big salvo at that time was the Education White Paper, a program for higher education transformation, really trying to flesh out the scope and the landscape of what it would take to transform higher education. Then the other one years I would point to would be 2001, a national plan for higher education was put together. It also referenced the profile of the academic staff and the need to transform that. And then the National Working Group for Restructuring Higher Education was also charged with trying to come up with concrete implementation plans and targets to transform. And then we get a great deal of activity in the years 2008 to 2019. And the ones I have put in black are the ones that focus particularly on changing the academic profile. You know, that workshop that was held in 2009, convened at Rhodes University, and I think the chairperson was Salim Badat, but it involved people from universities, from HESA, from the Department of Higher Education. It was a big conversation about creating the next generation of academics. And then, of course, the 2015 framework put together by the Department of Higher Education, programs that were concretely aimed at changing the pipeline and to make sure that we could create this new generation, this next generation. So addressing different levels, emerging scholars, the NGAP program. And now the program that you're in, the Future Professors Program in 2019, which is targeted at developing academic excellence and creating a different kind of professorate. Now, I only highlighted some key initiatives. This does not cover what individual institutions have done. It's not covered a lot of work of other government departments and even private initiatives. But I just want to take a moment to refer to Kanji and Syed, who in 2013, they did an archaeology of what had been done to deliver on the promise of transformation of higher education. And this is what they said up until 2013. In terms of the last, they said 4 ministers who produced 7 white papers, 3 green papers, 25 bills, 35 acts, 11 regulations, 52 government notices, and 26 calls for comments. The point is, there have been a number of government-led initiatives, a lot of activity to try to deliver on the promise. So we could look at this and we could take 2 perspectives. One would be a negative perspective. Are we looking at a nearly 30-year saga of missteps, confusion, and false starts. That would be one interpretation. And if you read the articles, there are those who have that perspective that, you know, there's been a lot of bureaucratic morass. Lots of things were done, but not very effectively always. On the other hand, we could take a more optimistic lens to this nearly 30-year effort. And that's the one that I take. And maybe it's in a sense of the way that I kind of think about the work that we need to do. What I take away from that is that transformation has been on the radar screen of this nation since the dawn of democracy. It's never been taken off the table. And we can contrast that with other countries, my country of birth, where first of all, it's never had this kind of attention at a national level. So we should take some optimism from the point that there's been sustained effort to address transformation, probably not with the success that we would desire, but it's been on the radar screen. So that raises the question of progress. So where are we? How much progress? So that's the other thing I did. I started looking for articles that tried to talk about, so to what extent have we transformed South African higher education? And, you know, I didn't read every study. I did not do my own analysis, statistical analysis of HEMIS data. I'm just going to point to a couple that I found. I was particularly interested in longitudinal studies because longitudinal studies can give us a sense of how things have changed over time. So I found a couple, and this one was published in Higher Education in 2018. And I see a typo up there. It should be 2005 to 2015, looking at a 10-year range. And if you kind of just look at that graph, at that picture, and you look at Black academics, you can see, if you look at the black bar, some change. Let me go back, sorry. There has been some movement, a decline in white academics, white females about the same, sort of plateaus here for Indian and colored, but some movement. If we look at by academic rank, we get a kind of a picture of what has happened. We can see that if we look at Black African, what they used in this graph, if we look at the black lines, some small incremental changes. Same on this side, some, but if you look at this, you can see why we need the NGAP program. You know, that the higher ranks, senior lecturer, associate professor, remain predominantly held by white academics. If you take a snapshot of 2019 data that was in the statistics presented by the Department of Higher Education, you know, if you look at those percentages, they're not what they were in 1996. So I think if you said the progress, the profile is changing in terms of numbers, at least. Maybe not as much as it should have, and not at the pace that it should. But I don't think representation or numbers is really enough to give us a sense of where are we on transformation. I think the problems with representation, it produces people to data points. And this idea that transformation is about replacing white male bodies with Black and brown female and female bodies. It's about substitution, but we're clearly talking about something else and something much more challenging. That's not the end goal. So then what I did is I said, well, let's look at the qualitative aspects of transformation for academics. what is it like? What's the lived experience in this chaos as we try to transform? So then I looked at studies that had looked at the lived experience of academics, where people have gone out and talked to Black and female academics, including white academics. What are your experiences of transformation? And this list is not a full list of their findings, but the key things that they heard from the people themselves. And I think if you look at that list and take a moment to read it, you can see that the general theme that comes through is that there is a big gap between espoused commitments to transformation and what is actually happening, and how that is experienced on the ground by real living human beings. And so, you know, as somebody said in one of the articles, you know, I feel like I'm compliance. I don't feel like I belong. I don't feel like I'm accepted into this university. A lot of these studies were done in historically white universities. Some were done in others. But, you know, this feeling of being a space invader, being not welcomed into this environment, epistemic violence, not acknowledging different ways of doing knowledge or doing research that might look at other topics, blocking agency when people wanted to be agentic or trying to do things differently, trying to be doing it academic differently in how they did their research or how they engage with study, the students being constrained. And I think the last one I have there, battle fatigue, this sense of being worn down from microaggressions, everyday racism, sexism, classism, that this was draining the ability to be creative, to do the research, to do the work, because a lot of the energy was taken just to survive in these institutional cultures that were hostile to the idea of transformation. So what I would say to everyone, I think we would agree that representation does not equal transformation. And so clearly we have a lot more work to do. And I'm particularly concerned being on the advisory board of the FPP, and also for my work as Deputy Dean for Research and Postgraduate Studies at UP. I am worried about the burden, or what I would call the dual expectations of having a crown and also at the same time having a burden placed upon our next generation, our future generation of academics. I want to dwell on this a minute. In FPP, we see we're trying to create the future professorate, future professors. In the NGAP programs, we talk about the next generation. Just putting our early and mid-career talented academics, just putting you in that category, I think creates this kind of paradoxical almost position, a crown and a burden at the same time. The crown is, we selected you for these programs because you have the potential, you have demonstrated the potential to be a great scholar, to have impact, to do great research, to be a great teacher, to make a difference. But will we end up burdening you by then, after the 2 years of this program, these external interventions, putting you into institutional cultures that are not ready to reap the benefits of what you can bring? So I think we have to think about that the next frontier, if we're going to reap the benefits of these interventions, which we have finally come to, doing concrete things to change the profile of academia in South Africa. We have to make sure we maximize that it is a good experience for each of you, that you are able to fulfill your career aspirations, your personal aspirations, and also be equipped and prepared and energized to do all that we are expecting you to do. We have placed heavy expectations in anointing you in this crown, in the investment. And so we have to do something about changing our institutional cultures. Otherwise, it's like throwing people into the lion's dens in many institutions. Now, I don't want to make sweeping statements. Some institutional cultures are better than others. Some disciplines are better than others. And so it's uneven. But in organizational behavior and management sciences, we think of institutional cultures, organizational cultures, like an iceberg. You may know this metaphor. This metaphor is instructive to the work that we need to do. You know, only 10% of an iceberg can be seen. 90% of it, according to scientists, can't be seen. I guess if we watch the movie Titanic, we know this. And so the problem with culture is that it is so deeply embedded in many institutions, which makes it very hard to change. And so it's made up of different layers. So of course, there's the practices. We can see how people do professor, who has ranks, how people teach, how they behave, what are the management systems for professors, how a department's structured. But the things that are keeping all of those practices in place that are not always positive practices are these, what's below, the deeply held assumptions. And let me talk a little bit about those. And I want to draw upon my experiences, particularly being the head of a department, not only in South Africa, but also in the US, and also my own experiences of trying to become a professor. And specifically in the South African context, when I was Deputy Dean for Research and Postgraduate Studies at the University of Pretoria. These taken for granted assumptions, you know, that the dominant group believes in, they are so deeply embedded that they become normalized, where they are believed to be the only way of being an academic in terms of the work that one does. And so these practices are believed to be the way to be an excellent professor. And normally they are derived from the people who got there first. And what happens over time, the people in that culture believe that this is what allowed them to be successful. We are successful because of these deeply held assumptions. And how dare these new folks come in and try to change that? And so what these practices do is they end up suffocating, literally suffocating possibilities of other ways of knowing, different epistemologies, other ways of organizing and managing, and other ways of being a professor. And why this is so important, as much as we can do external interventions, academics live in their departments. They live within their faculties. They live within their academic communities or professional associations, which themselves may not be transformed. When I was Deputy Dean for Research and Postgraduate Studies at the University of Pretoria, I spent a great deal of my time in supporting lifting up, running tackle. I would say literally running tackle to support early career and mid-career academics of all races and all genders, because the culture was not ready for them. And they were not getting the kinds of support and inclusion always in their departments. And see, there's also these deeply embedded relations, power relations on multiple levels in our institutions. There is the power differentials between management and academics. And then there's the power differentials within academic ranks. And so we have to deal with power relations and trying to think about how those are impeding transforming the professorate. So even though, for example, we complain that managerialism has eroded the power of academics, hey, in many of our institutions, dominant group professors still take whatever power is left over. And so they end up with the most privileges, often the most resources. They get to gatekeep. They sit on the selection and promotion committees. They sometimes get the bigger offices, and they have the greater influence on departmental decisions and also on the faculty, which can end up placing burdens on those who are in the junior ranks. Heavier teaching loads. I heard this constantly from the academics in my faculty. Access to fewer resources. Limited access to that tacit knowledge you need to succeed as a professor. I think you get my point. And what happens is these things appear to be neutral, but because they collide in the sense that most Black and female academics are still in the lower ranks, these everyday practices have a differential impact on their ability to be the professors they want to become. But let me just add one of my pet peeves. The power is not just a commodity where we think of these powerful dominant group professors who hog power. Power, as Foucault would say, there's disciplinary power, not in the sense of discipline, but there's other practices in the whole system that keep the status quo in place. If anyone's who know me, this is one of my pet complaints, that how we reward academics, how we reward academic performance. So we espouse A, but we often reward B. Two of those that just are on my list. We say we want research that has local importance, that addresses the needs of our country. But what do? We give more value and more rewards for international impact. What does international impact get measured by? Publication in so-called international journals, which are not really international, but that's the mark that you have done well as a professor. So that puts pressure, though. We're asking for more research on local issues, but the reward system sends another signal. My other one is around how we think about research output. It's very managerial. We chop our intellectual contributions into units. And so we want to allocate the rewards by units. So if there's 4 authors, you're going to get 0.25 units of credit. And that works so much against the idea of collaboration. And so what I'm trying to say is that transformation has to take a deep dive into our cultures and think about those practices and how they need to transform to really realize this this aspiration for a different type of professorate. So I think we're at a critical juncture. I wrote about this in an article I wrote about in terms of the organizational management field. What's a critical juncture? Well, it's a moment or certain window in time where there's significant possibility of a decisive transition. So changing our institutional cultures is the next frontier. In addition to representation, we have to start doing deep work and sustained work on transforming our institutional cultures. Or my fear is, I think it won't happen, but we will stifle the possibilities we've created through programs like FPP. We may even have people who leave the system, which I hope won't happen. But let me stop there because I've been doing a lot of critique. I think that the even harder challenge is coming up with the otherwise. What's the new state? What would a transformed higher education look like? What would a transformed professorate be like, act like? What would be the practices? And so it's easier to critique. Now, critique is necessary, but it's easier to critique. But the much harder challenge for us is imagining and creating the otherwise. Sarah Ahmed, the critical feminist scholar, she says it well. There is a difference between doing critique and doing the doing. And why is that difficult? And I'll speak for myself. We often don't have the experiences nor the vocabularies to do that. Our experience and vocabularies can hold us in the present. How can you speak about something new when you only have the present vocabulary, the words, the ideas? I simply say it to people, we've never lived in a world without inequalities. We've never lived in South Africa where there hasn't been inequalities, where there has been, we've been free of racism, sexism, classism, all of the isms. So the otherwise is the difficult task. What would we create? What should we create? And if you're looking at that picture on the right and it's deliberately blurred, it's blurred to make that last point. The otherwise is largely unknown and hard to configure with certainty. But cultures do change, and they can change, and we have to believe that. So what are some of the elements that we can draw upon to change a culture? It's not necessarily a strategic plan, but I think there's some elements, my point of view, I hopefully will discuss this. We got to figure out accountability. Who is responsible for this transformational change? Can we put it all on the government? Clearly not the case. Is it just programs like FPP? No. So, and also on the other side of accountability, one of the things that disturbed me and what I've seen is often you can see that a bright young academic left because of the lack of support, being undermined, not allowed to thrive. And no one is held accountable for that loss. Where is the accountability? The second thing about culture change, we think we have to have a big salvo, but a critical mass of committed and agentic actors can engage in new behaviors. What Sarah Ahmed said, we need to start doing things differently. So we don't expect you fellows to mimic. We don't expect you to replicate. We expect that you will do being a professor differently. You will do the academic differently. And so Judith Butler, I put some references there because I'm skirting over this very quickly. These are some of the sources that are informing my thinking about this otherwise. I put them there in case anybody wants to read any of that. But our own performativity, that's just a way of saying that we can bring into change, we can have some influence by doing it differently, doing a professor differently, doing leadership differently. Now, so how we enact being a great professor, a good teacher, can begin to shake up the status quo. And the last thing I'll leave you with is that in the field of organization and management and HRM, we have started talking about a new word, diversalizing, rather than diversity. That what we're engaged in is diversalizing. And using that word makes us think more about transformative inclusion as a process that's emergent. It's based on experimenting, trying new things, new imaginations, to identify practices that will create a new social order, a social order that promotes multiplicity, making space for multiple ways of being. And that we enable that, we value it, and we strengthen it, and we keep building upon that. And so for me, as a semi-retired professor who is approaching 75 years of age, I'm dwelling in the possibility. I want to ask you, as the future, the next generation, to dwell in the possibility. We have to know that we can transform what is now, that we can use what power we have, especially in doing the doing, to begin to press the levers to transform our institutional cultures. Now, I'm not suggesting, and please don't do this, I'm not suggesting this means you have to go out and run out a job in management or take a position. Some of you may already do this, but you need to think about what can I do from my power, my domain of power, which is based on your knowledge, it's based on your referent power, and that we can all make a contribution to dwelling in the possibility. I probably ran over time, but can I leave you with these three quotes that animate my energy to still do the work of transformation. I think many people know the quote from Margaret Mead. We don't need a lot of people. We do eventually need a critical mass. So I'm hoping that the FPP program will be funded for many cycles, and that some of the things that the FPP program is doing gets morphed into some of the things that institutions can do, our universities can do, that some of these things get replicated. And the one from Rural Kosa, I ask you, if not us, then who? And lastly, I think this is an admirable vision for transformation that was written in 2015 by the Transformation Strategy Group. I think it's something that pulls me, even when I am discouraged, to work for transformation. So I hope that all of the fellows, all of the people involved in making this program work, that we dwell in the possibilities of what can be. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you very much, Stella, for that insightful presentation and for sharing with us, your views, your ideas, but also your own experiences in terms of what we have seen working, in terms of what you have seen being a challenge. I really liked the policy evolution which you provided at the beginning, but also the importance of this program. And I do concur with you that we need to have, programs like this continuing. You indicated that it has been a 30-year effort. And actually, I'm one of the cohorts that were there 30 years ago into being, undergoing a number of different training programs. And this is where one is at the moment. What does this say? It says that such interventions, they do work. And opportunities are created, but they need to be, grabbed and utilized. And your world, can change. And you find yourself in a space and in a position where you never thought you would be. And I also do agree that the burden and the crown is being put on, is going to be put on this new or the next generation of scholars. I think where I am at the moment, I'm carrying the burden, as the dean of the Faculty of Education. We are looking for young scholars like this. We want them to come in. But, one of the challenges which we're having is that, those that come, sometimes they don't stay. And the question is, why don't they stay? Some of them, yes, they've been trained in scholarship, but they're looking at the ladder. They want to climb. We need them there. But the issue of the timing of when to move to the next level is very important, and it's very, critical. The issue of the institutional culture is also very, very critical. And I think some of the young scholars here, the fellows in this program, will identify with some of the views which you shared. It is changing, and institutional culture has got nothing to do with numbers. Yes, numbers do play a role, but even when numbers are not there, you find that some of these cultures are so resilient that they continue to be perpetuated in the absence of those people who brought them into being. And thank you very much for those views. But at this juncture, I think I'm going to invite fellows to react to your presentation, to ask questions, to comment.
Great.
And I see there are also mentors here. They are also welcome to make their comments. Over to you, fellows. The floor is open. What you can do is just to raise your hand on that icon next to the chat on the right is the reaction. If you can just raise your hand, and we'll recognize you and make your contribution. Alternatively, you can just unmute and start, asking your questions. Okay, I see Matabo and Samantha and Jeremiah. Starting with Matabo.
Thank you very much, Prof, for a wonderful presentation. It really resonates a lot with what is happening on the ground and what we are experiencing. My question for you is, maybe you might have suggestions on how to deal with academic bullying as part of the institutional culture, because more often than not, it is not recognized as such. And the bullies are in such positions that it doesn't reflect as bullying, but as managing or leading in a way that suppresses one's creativity or advances into becoming a better academic or researcher. And that stifles every aspect of being. And the other question then would be, how does one navigate the brotherhood or the club at the top where only certain people qualify to get into the club? No matter how hard one works, they cannot break into that mold because they don't belong. What tips can you give us if you do have them? And how have you dealt with in your own experiences? Thank you very much for inspiring talk.
Okay, Mataba, thank you for the question. And first of all, I'm sorry. I'm very hurt that you are experiencing the things you're experiencing. Let me express that. Bullying. You see, this is what I'm saying. You know, okay, I can tell you what you can do, but the onus is upon the university. My goodness. There should be a place for you to be able to go and say, I am experiencing bullying. Bullying is a serious crime against any individual. You know, it's very difficult. That's what I was talking about. So to the extent you're in the lower ranks, what are your defenses? So I think one of the things to do is to try, and it's related to your second question about what do you do? One of the things I had to do was to find a network, find other people that I could connect with. First of all, to check. I think this happened to me. Did I really experience this? Just for your own sanity, you see? You need to see if you can have an allyship with a more senior academic who would be willing to run tackle for you. I use the word tackle. One of the things that Professor Siholdi is raising his head. You know, one of the things I did at UP is I ran tackle for the young academics. You know, I would go and try to intervene on their behalf, you know. And in fact, just and this is why I'm saying those of us who do make it to the top, we need to protect. We need to literally almost put our bodies to protect this precious young early scholars. You know, in fact, when I was leaving the University of Pretoria, one of the things I heard from one of the young Black academics was that one of the senior academics had said, well, now that Stella's leaving, you won't have anybody to protect you. So I felt great because it meant I had done my job. But seriously, you know, I don't know what your personality is. You know, I have a colleague now that I'm trying to support in that. But one of the things, you know what, that I found in my own career and also in my research on women in corporate leadership, you know what disarms a bully is your success. You know, so you must then say, I'm not going to let this devalue my motivation. And so you must keep on trying to be successful because it's really about intimidation. But the real issue is that there's no system for you to report that bully. The second thing about breaking into the club, well, I say to you, form your own club. That's what I did. You know, I was always the only Black woman in my faculty. And so you need to find your club, and your club may be people in this program. The program is giving you a great opportunity to develop a support network. Find other people in your discipline who are working on similar topics. Even go beyond the boundaries of South Africa, because that will keep you anchored. That will give you resources to succeed. You don't have to rely on that old club. Find a new club, a new playground in which to play. That's what I did.
Thank you very much, Stella. I realize that we've got 30 minutes discussion and we're already into our 12 minutes. So I'm going to take 3 questions, which I'm going to invite you to respond to. So if you can please confine yourself to just 1 question so that others can be able to get their chance of raising their questions. Samantha, Jeremiah, and Knox, in that order, please.
Hi, Prof. Thank you so much for your wonderful talk. I was thoroughly inspired by it. I just have a quick question, and possibly in part you have already answered it with Motabo's question. But recently I've been struggling with the issue of voices. You know, there's so many voices, especially in the academic space, telling you what to do and what not to do, or what to say and what not to say. And I often find that in trying to be a change agent, you find yourself spending a lot of time challenging the process, arguing. There's a lot of arguments. So I'm trying to figure out where you strike the balance between being assertive and or silencing yourself and making a statement, by silencing yourself to make a statement. And I just want to ask you if you perhaps have any practical advice with regards to how to really effect change, but with striking a balance between the arguing and contesting everything, but at the same time not silencing yourself too much and that your voice is not heard. I hope my question makes sense.
No,
if you could
makes
give me
sense.
some practical advice. Thank you, Prof.
Samantha, your question makes perfect sense. Do you run around screaming, "The house is on fire, the house is on fire"? You know what? If you got to pick your battles, and that's what I did. I always pick my battles, because if you constantly see, people tune you out. If you're constantly critiquing, as Sarah Ahmed said, she says critique is important, but it cannot be the only thing you can do. So sometimes you don't need to use your voice. You need to take action instead. So pick your battles. You know, think about what are the things that cross the boundaries of what I assume to be acceptable. And then work more, what we call a temperate radical. A temperate radical, temper when you need to temper. So for example, if you, I had a case when I was at the university, a case where I was very upset because it was evident that a senior academic had decided that this young woman academic would be stalled, that she would never get her PhD. And he literally said this to her: "I'm going to make sure you never finish this PhD." And he would just give her this general feedback. Every time she handed in chapters, it was sort of like, "Oh, do some more work," very useless feedback. And so after 2 years, she came to me and she wanted to know what to do. So my initial reaction was, I need to go up to this person's office and yell at them. You see, that was my natural reaction. Coming from the South Bronx, coming from a tough neighborhood, that was let me go and fight. But then I thought, no, okay, I'm going to use a different kind of temperate radicalism. I said to her, all I need for you to do is to write an email to me to say that you would like to change your supervisor. And so I used what power I had to do the doing. I changed her and got her a supervisor that allowed her to do her PhD. So think about it that way, Samantha. Do I need to yell or do I need to take some action? Because yelling doesn't always get the outcome, and you end up expending your emotional energy on the yelling versus the doing.
Thank you, Jeremiah.
Thank you, Prof. It was really very inspirational. When I look at the stats you provided, yeah, it really reflects what is currently happening in the higher education sector. But just a quick one, Prof. Looking at the leadership issue in higher education sector, which is, I think, very important. And for me, I just wonder if you can help us to unpack this conundrum, Prof. Because when you look at people who are in leadership, it's either they lose their image or they lose their hair. So I really wanted to find out from you, can you kindly share with us really your winning formula in terms of getting the strength and the energy to sustain you to be in this position for so long? Like you were saying, you have been in many positions. And for me, I think that's the biggest challenge we have seen in higher education sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremiah. And you know what? I don't know if I have an answer to that question. As I told you, what pulls me is you. What keeps me in this when I could retire, you know? Even my husband says to me, you know, retire, retire. But what keeps me in this is you. Really, when I say that, I'm not being facetious, because I know that anything I can do to support the next generation, the future generation, in the end is going to be a better life for me even, you know? I'm here in South Africa to stay. So by you doing well, I also will do well. So that's my personal motivation. And I want to give back because there were other people who helped me. You know, not everybody in your department is a villain. I wouldn't have gotten to where I was if there wasn't senior people who helped me. So part of that is having your own anchor. You need to have an anchor for yourself, even as a scholar. Why am I doing the work that I'm doing? Why do I ask the research questions I ask? Why do I want to teach? What is the engine? What's your internal engine? You know? And, you know, when I became Deputy Dean for Research and Postgraduate Studies in the faculty, I took the job because I thought I had something I could contribute, that I could leave the faculty better off. And so that drove me. But what's interesting is, I'll just tell you two stories. When I had the interview with the then Vice Chancellor, and she said to me, one of her questions was, what are you going to do to increase research output? And I said, nothing. I said, nothing. Well, I don't think that's the answer she expected, because I basically said to her, that's not what I see this job about. My job is not to increase research output. She said, then what do you think the job is? I said, the interpretation for me is that my job is to help every academic in this faculty find their own scholarly voice and to support them in getting energized around doing research. So what I've done is I've always defined for myself, you know, and I told my dean, you know, she's giving me a job description. I said to her, I don't need a job description. I know my job. I know what I need to do, and I believe it will work. So part of that anchoring, Jeremiah, is you need to be clear about your identity. What are you going to bring to this role? You know, if I interviewed you 5 years after you left this role, what would you say? How is this department? How is your institution different because you were in that position for 5 years? So that's what allows me to do that. The other thing, frankly, is you got to take care of yourself. You have to dwell in the possibilities. But I do take care of myself. I try to eat healthily. I try to exercise. I continue to do my research. And I have a scholarly community. I have a community of people that when my well goes dry, I go and replenish it with them. And if you don't, so don't isolate yourself. I know one of the goals of this program is that this cohorts, phase 1 and phase 2, that you are going to be building a network that will become a source for replenishment as you're trying to deal with these burdens. Don't try to do it alone. Don't take this heroic, masculine, hierarchical sense of being a leader. You'll drain yourself. That's a long answer to your question.
Thank you very much, Stella. Knox?
Thank you so much, Prof. Nkomo. That was absolutely phenomenal. And it really speaks to me very directly on a very personal level. And that is linked to an experience that I've actually had this year. I work at Stellenbosch University and was the first Black female scientist to be in the faculty. I arrived there in 2005. And guess what? It's 2021 and there are only two people at that position. And quite honestly, that change is going on very slowly. And I want to make a comment and then also a suggestion.
Thank you.
Firstly, often, you know, these actions are not necessarily explicit. And when you approach leaders, whether they be at the departmental level, at the dean level, and right up to, you know, the higher officers of the university, the rules, the regulations, this box ticking, number ticking is used as a way, as a shield to say that people cannot do anything about transformation because they themselves are constrained by the system. And that, as far as I'm concerned, is some kind of implicit bias because the context of different people and different lived experiences is never ever taken into consideration. That's not a South African issue. As far as I'm aware, it's actually a global problem.
Definitely.
So the system itself needs to change. And I don't know how we actually bring about that change. And so in the background of that, I think it's wonderful for us to hear you speak about this and for us to be able to deliberate on these issues. But the problem is that we are not the ones that should only be hearing this message. It should be much broader.
Yes.
And so as a suggestion, I would say that the FBP program should actually consider bringing in the people who are sitting in these managerial positions because they are the ones that need to be hearing this.
Yeah.
You know, it doesn't matter how much I can be preaching this at my particular institution and to my dean, because firstly, they're just going to go, but that's not your area of expertise.
Exactly.
What is it that you know about it? So you actually need people in leadership roles to canvass at these very institutions and at the level where the people should be hearing this. I would have loved to have had my dean, my head of research sit in on this together with us so that they can understand what our constraints are. And so hopefully that will allow them to be able to make decisions that will actually ultimately lead to real change. So that's my comment. And I know I'm feeling quite impassioned by this, but it is a huge problem. And if you look at that chat, you will see that many of us are experiencing all kinds of injustices on a day-to-day basis. Thank you very much for your presentation. You articulated it beautifully and your teachings have hit spot on. Thank you.
Thank you, Knox. You are absolutely on spot. I kind of alluded to the point you're making. We haven't figured out the accountability for change. It's sort of like, this is a rough analogy, but I think it's the right one. As I said, I had many clashes with my dean about, look, this HOD, this academic should be disciplined. They should be held accountable. You see, so there's no accountability for squandering this talent, for practicing an inhumane interaction with people. But I agree with you, Knox. Maybe part of that next frontier is a program for quote unquote the leadership. You know, I say this in my book that just got re-released about, you know, Black and white women in corporate America, that we're always trying to fix the victim. We're always trying to fix the victim, you know. They need mentoring, they need development, they need capacity building. But where is there any serious interventions on the other side of it? You see? And I noticed in the FPP program, I'm not criticizing the program, but I noticed in the write-up it says, in collaboration with the universities. What does that mean, in collaboration? So we need to do some work on the other side of the equation. So Knox, thank you for articulating that, because I do agree, we're not working on that enough on that side of the equation. And that's why I had that thing about the burden, you know, the burden that we are placing on young, bright academics like yourself to go into these hostile climates and to wage a struggle when we're allowing them, in a sense, to get to abdicate their responsibilities, you know, and that makes me angry, frankly. So that's the next frontier. That's part of that next frontier, that we must deal with that. Because I think what's happening too now, because it's happening around the world, you know, as we call for decolonization, as people are challenging these systems, there's backlash and resistance. So the backlash and resistance to, you know, the diagram I showed you, to hold on to the status quo. You know, people don't give up the status quo easily.
So if you can please mute. Thank you.
So maybe we need to make a suggestion to the Minister of Higher Education about what about some programs for the other side of this equation.
Thank you. We are left with 1 minute. I see 2 hands. If they can please just raise their points in 20 seconds, and we'll have Stella responding in 40 seconds.
Okay, I'll be sure.
Kerti, before you, there was somebody I lost.
Sinead.
Sinead, yes, Sinead. If you can unmute and also open your video.
Thank you so much. Sorry. I'm in 2 devices because of one, the camera doesn't work, and the one it does. Sorry about that. I want to say thank you so much, Prof. Stella. I feel like I found a kinswoman in you, and I appreciate your straight talk. I really appreciated, this is just a comment, I really appreciated the quote on transformation and how it was also about self-reflection. It's not about policy, it's not about numbers. I've said this before when we talked about decolonization, and I've said to colleagues, we can't talk about decolonization if we don't ask ourselves who's sitting at our dinner tables, who's in our lives, who's in our homes, and how are we living, and then how does that then show up in our institutions and our policies. And I think the more we do this kind of work of transformation, of actually looking, reflecting, doing really uncomfortable work in ourselves, the more then it will speak to the policy and it will speak to the actual change making. And I think when we reflect on these prejudices and biases, all of us, we might have some really positive experiences of maybe perceived adversaries actually becoming allies at some point. So thank you.
Thank you for that comment. I agree 100%. Difficult conversations, but we need to have them. And Chika, can I say something, Professor Cioli, about the point you raised about the compensation and that the young scholars they're leaving and they want to move up quickly? Well, that has a lot to do with how we do compensation. The only way to normally improve your salary is to go to another rank. Is there another way to do that? Is there another way to reward excellence within rank? We haven't seen, these are the kind of things that would benefit everybody. So there's just this push to either take a management position to improve your salary, or to try to go up too early, or to do instrumental. Let me just do the quantity of publications. And I understand that, because if you think about early career and mid-career academics, their time may coincide with the need for money, because they have families, they're trying to buy a home. So I understand it. And the other thing we always say from an organizational behavior point of view, if you have people, if you're a dean and you have people leaving, instead of saying, why are they leaving? You should be asking, why can't I keep them? Because, the predictor of leaving is intent to leave, where people are not getting what they need. So I think the question should be asked, not why are they leaving, but why I'm not able to keep them? What am I doing? What have I done or haven't done?
All right. Thank you very much, Stella, for those.
Thank you.
I'm going to be very quick, Chika. I just wanted to say welcome, Prof. Nkomo. Thank you for such an inspiring address. We continue to be inspired by you and hope that that continues into the future. But I would like to say that when going through this process of screening applicants for the future professors, we had 116 applications.
Good.
We understood quite early in the day that institutional context and that environment is something that we have absolutely no control of. And that while we could create a pathway or point the torch in the direction, we actually could not contend with the quite hard issues of visible and invisible barriers within universities. Thanks, Prof. Stella.
Thank you, Kitty, and great to see you again and to be part of this. Wonderful. No, I agree with you. That's why I call it the next frontier.
The University of Johannesburg, the future reimagined.